Hey there and welcome back to NBA 2K17. My name is Pete and today we complete the first year of NBA 2K17's MyGM or MyLeague mode with the Miami Heat. Now on paper, in the game, the Heat have a very good roster with a strong core, a nice number of solid role players and a good amount of young talent. The main difference between the 2K17 Miami Heat and the real-life Miami Heat is the role of Chris Bosh. While he is listed as a perfectly healthy 86 overall player in the latest 2K roster, in real life his career sadly seems to be pretty much over because of his health problems. With that not being the case in NBA 2K17, the Miami Heat are in a pretty good position this year even though they lost Dwayne Wade in free agency. So let's have a look at the situation and let's begin with the starting unit. Your starting point guard is without a doubt Goran Dragic. He is the third highest ranked player on the team and also your only true point guard, which instantly brings us to the other guard spot. The shooting guard in Miami is a tiny bit crowded. A total of 5 players are listed as shooting guard, with Dion Waiters and Tyler Johnson probably making the strongest case for the starting spot. Johnson is also the only one of these 5 players that can play the point guard, which likely makes him a better choice off the bench, but as always, how you structure your rotation is up to you and there are several solutions available here. Starting at the small forward will either be the more inside-focused James Johnson or, and he's my favorite, the defensive-oriented Justice Winslow. If you want to keep things super realistic and play the season without Bosh, then Johnson is also a good fit at the power forward. The clear-cut starter at the power forward is then of course Chris Bosh himself. If you want to play without him, then either Willie Reed or one of Johnson or Winslow can get the starting spot. At the center there is not much discussion, as the team's best player Bosh Whiteside is locked as the starter, and because he's severely lacking a backup, he will likely have to play heavy minutes as well. Speaking of those backups, for both the point guard and the center spot, the Miami Heat have no true backups. At the point guard, Tyler Johnson makes the most sense to play behind Dragic, and at the center you can either choose between Willie Reed and Udonis Haslem. However, both are not optimal, as Reed will already get a good amount of minutes at the power forward, and Haslem is undersized at 6'8" and also 36 years old and on an expiring contract. With those two problematic positions out of the way, we can have a look at the almost too comfortable situation at the shooting guard. A 3-man rotation for both guard spots with Dragic, Waiters and Johnson is manageable, but the services of Wayne Ellington, Rodney McGruder and Josh Richardson would be completely wasted. While all 3 are on expiring deals and their long-term role with the team remains questionable at this point, I would personally add one of the 3 to the rotation just to give you a bit more depth and flexibility. In terms of backups, the small forward is likely the easiest position here. If Johnson starts, then Winslow comes off the bench, and if Winslow starts, Johnson gets the bench spot. Both Okaro White and Luke Babbitt are not going to see minutes unless you have an injury problem. For the power forward, and I'm just gonna assume that you're going to play with Chris Bosh in the rotation, both Willie Reed and Josh McRoberts are the favorites for the backup spot. That largely also depends on who backs up Whiteside at the center. Now up next, let's have a look at the expiring contracts, and with Johnson, Haslem and Babbitt, 3 of your players expire straight up. Babbitt and Haslem are likely not going to be rotation pieces for the Heat, but Johnson could leave a hole to fill. None of them can be re-signed during the season. On top of that, with a total of 8 options, the Heat have a bit of uncertainty going into the next offseason, although 5 of those 8 are team options. Wayne Ellington, Justice Winslow, Josh Richardson, Rodney McGruder and Okaro White all have team options coming up, and for all but White it makes sense to take them. That is, unless you consider the $6.27 million for Ellington too much, but we will talk about that in a second. The 3 player options coming up are on Josh McRoberts, Dion Waiters and Willie Reed, and those are a bit more critical as we might not only lose our starting shooting guard, but also the entirety of our backup big man. Looking at the draft picks next, and a lot of empty space here, yet the Heat are not exactly well equipped when it comes to draft picks. The 2018 first rounder is technically in Phoenix, but it is protected up until the 7th spot in the 2018 draft, so if the Heat fall anywhere between 1 and 7 they keep the pick, and instead the 2019 first rounder goes to Phoenix, then without any protections. Let's quickly also go over the cap space. Despite 3 pretty large contracts on Bosh, Whiteside and Dragic, the Heat are only $3 million above the cap this year, and potentially up to $23 million below the cap next season. The 8 options alone are already worth over $28 million though, and that will then still leave you with 3 players entering free agency. So the salary cap is something that we should be managing carefully. Now, before we get into the moves, as is usual in this series, here are your 3 key questions that need to be answered before going into year 1 with the Heat. Number 1. How do you structure your rotations at the guard spots and down low? With only one true point guard but a whooping 5 shooting guards, you have a bunch of choices for your guard rotation. The same is true down low, where the starters are likely set, but the bench gives you a lot of different options. Figuring out a rotation that works for you and all the players involved is key if you want to go deep into the playoffs. Question number 2. Which one of your shooting guards or small forwards gets traded? Let's face it, having 9 players occupy these 2 positions is a healthy overkill. You are in dire need of a backup point guard as well as a backup center, and at least one of those 9 guys could be used to acquire such a player. And question number 3, are you trying to push your core to one last championship, or will you rebuild for a better chance? The core of Dragic, Bosh and Whiteside is likely good enough to get you somewhat deep into the playoffs, but it is still outmatched by a small number of other teams. Going for one more ring in Miami would likely mean you have to bring in one more star and sacrifice some young guys to free up cap space and bring in veterans. Alternatively, you could ride out the contract of at least Chris Bosh and spend the next 3 to 4 seasons acquiring pieces and picks to grow your already pretty talented young group of players. And one of those young players is Justice Winslow, who alongside Bosh, Dragic and Whiteside is one of the 4 players that I consider untradeable for this scenario. As you might know, I try to keep things as realistic as possible, and even though Winslow is not a superstar, he is still one of the most valuable players the team has right now. And with that being said, let's get going. Here are 3 moves to make as the Miami Heat in NBA 2K17's MyGM or MyLeague mode. Move number 1. Trade Luke Babbitt or Okaro White for a 3rd string backup point guard. We'll start with a somewhat obvious move here. Both White and Babbitt are likely not seeing playing time in your default rotation, and one of them can safely be moved without you losing much flexibility. I would personally pick Babbitt because he's older and expiring, while White can still develop, and we also have a 2-year team option coming up with him. Our target is a 3rd string backup point guard, so a player that can come off the bench behind both Dragic and Tyler Johnson, who I would pick as the main backup guard with minutes split between point guard and shooting guard. So this does not have to be a spectacular player, just someone who can fill in should either Dragic or Johnson be unavailable for stretches. There are also a good number of players who fit this description available on the free agent market, so you could just go out and sign a player like Tony Roten or Grievous Vasquez, but you would have to cut somebody else from your roster before you do that. If you want to settle for a trade, then here are a few good options. Number 1, Luke Babbitt for Kay Felder from Cleveland. Felder is a young dynamic player that will likely not see much playing time in Cleveland. His size makes him exclusive to the point guard spot, but that is exactly why we want him to fill a hole in our rotation. Alternatively, for White and Haslem, you can get Satoransky and Ochefu from Washington. Satoransky is a very tall point guard with a 3-year contract, Haslem is added to make salaries work, and Ochefu does not need to be extended. Another option would be White and Babbitt for Briante Weber and Christian Wood from Charlotte. You would lose both White and Babbitt in this trade, but acquire an additional power forward, not that you need one, which is also why this trade is less than ideal. One more option would be Babbitt and McRoberts for James Young and George Niang from Indiana. This is certainly an interesting scenario in which you would also trade away the risk of McRoberts' player option, although creating another hole in your frontcourt rotation in the process. I actually didn't like any of those trades too much, so I went with the free agent option. I released Luke Babbitt and signed 25-year-old Pierre Jackson on a 1-year minimum deal with a team option for year 2. Move number 2, trade Wayne Ellington and acquire a true backup center. Ellington is one of many shooting guards on the team, and you don't desperately need him. Both Magruder and Richardson are eager to get any minutes Ellington might have, and Ellington is also up for a $6.27 million team option next summer. His trade value is somewhat high, and his contract also allows you to target moderately paid players, an option the 2 aforementioned players do not give you. What we're looking for is a true backup center, someone who is comfortable down low, defending, rebounding, and maybe even some scoring, and definitely someone who's able to step into the rotation directly behind Whiteside immediately. If needed, we can package Haslem in this trade as well, as he is possibly retiring but definitely expiring and not a part of your normal rotation anyway. Another good option would be to work Josh McRoberts into things and get rid of his player option. If you're able to get a player who is truly capable of playing 15 minutes per game behind Whiteside regularly, then this might be a smart move. As for trade targets, the Lakers might offer you 19-year-old Zubats, which I feel is a bit lopsided, but I'm also not willing to give up a first rounder for him. From the Pistons, you could get a package of Udry and Marjanovic if you add either Haslem or McRoberts, and that is definitely worth having a look at. Marjanovic will get paid $7 million for each of the next 3 seasons though, so keep that in mind for your long-term planning. The Bulls might be willing to part ways with Robert Lopez, and I think that could be a good move if you manage his mood correctly. I definitely think it's questionable how willing he is to come off the bench, but if you can keep him happy, maybe with the occasional start here and there or by throwing MyGM pitches at him, then having a player rated as high as him as the backup center is fantastic. The other downside is his contract, which runs for 3 years with a total value of over $40 million. Your financial flexibility will be gone if you make this move, so be warned. If you're looking to dump some salary in the process, then this offer of Aaron Brooks and Kevin Seraphin for Ellington and McRoberts might interest you. Brooks is a nice addition, even if you already signed the point guard, or he could be the one you rely on for this season before targeting one in the draft, for example. Seraphin is comfortable but not spectacular down low, but with an incredibly cheap team option and a bit of room to grow, he could turn into a nice piece. In the end, that's also the trade I went with, because I love myself a bit of cap space, and this trade gives us the opportunity to target a few more players in the offseason. Even though the game handles it that way, Brooks is not the main piece of this trade and can be let go once the season is over. And that brings us straight to move number 3, handling our options. Now your team is very much able to make the playoffs, but don't expect your run to go too deep. A first or second round exit is very likely, so the offseason is closer than you might think. Your first round pick is probably somewhere in the second half of the draft, so unless you have a strong draft class, there won't be much help available here. If you do land high in the draft, then I would focus on a point guard, shooting guard, or power forward. Far more important, however, are your options, so let's have a look at them one after the other. For me, Justice Winslow is a no-brainer, and so is Richardson. That's 2 very solid players already signed for less than $4 million combined, and also if you are still in possession of Ellington, this is the point where his option becomes really bad if we compare it to those we just signed. Depending on how they have developed throughout the season, both Okaro White and Rodney McGruder can also be brought back, as they are extremely cheap. I would personally not commit my money to them here though, as you might want to save some for free agency. If you followed my moves, then you now have Seraphin and Jackson with options, and I would personally accept them both as well, unless you have drafted a point guard on the same level or better than Jackson already. The real issue comes with the 2-player options at the bottom of the list. Dion Waiters' contract would just be too good to be true if you accepted his option, so a decline is the usual result here. Willie Reed usually accepts to come back for cheap. And with Johnson, Haslam, and very likely also Waiters expiring, you can now target a shooting guard in free agency or begin the next season and trade for one. I realize that losing Johnson and Waiters and likely being able to just bring back one of them is not ideal, but keep in mind that Johnson is not really essential as long as you have Winslow, and Waiters was also on an insanely cheap deal, a deal that definitely undervalued him by a lot. You also have salary increases on your 3 top players, so those will steal you the occasional million here and there as well, which despite dumping salary already might leave you in a bad spot here financially. So you might have to downgrade from Waiters at the shooting guard, but I think I'll leave that last bit up to you. So as usual, I hope you liked this video. Leave a thumbs up if you did, let me know how you would handle the heat in the comments below, and of course if you want to help out the channel, then feel free to subscribe. That's it from my part, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!